And that jarring cacophony tells you you're back with the Power of Three podcast. It's a Monday, which means it's time for us to take a look at another book from the annals of Doctor Who publishing history. I'm Kenny Smith, and today's book is a significant one. We're talking about Spiral Scratch, the 70th novel in the BBC Past Doctor Adventure series. It was written by Gary Russell, released on the 4th of August 2005, so just after the TV series had returned, and featured the 6th Doctor and Melanie Bush. Now, according to TARDISfandom.com, this was the final novel featuring the 6th Doctor. It's also the final 6th Doctor adventure overall, as the ending leads directly into the television story Time and the Rani. It was also the first Past Doctor Adventures novel to be published after the start of the revived series. The novel reveals the circumstances behind the Doctor's regeneration into his 7th incarnation, which were left a mystery in the televised version of the event. According to the novel, the 6th Doctor was already dying by the time the first Rani boarded his TARDIS after the events of this story, and her attack propagated the 6th Doctor's inevitable death sooner than it would have occurred. It is the first account of the regeneration in a BBC licensed venue. In 2015, Big Finish would later approach a different version of the regeneration in audio form by releasing The 6th Doctor, The Last Adventure. However, it remains the only official account of the regeneration in prose form, novelisations notwithstanding. And it also tells us the featured characters are Melanie Bush, Melanie Ball, Melina, Perry Brown, Evelyn Smythe and Frobisher. There seem to be a few names missing there, like Flip and Mrs. Clark, but hey, they come later. So let's look at the cover of the book. There's a picture of Colin from The Twin Dilemma, I think it is, standing there with his hands in his pockets, looking all confident as he does, and behind him there's some sort of swirly lines. They're not quite black lines, some of them are, but there's some sort of patterning behind them, and there's two beams of golden energy bursting out from the centre of this wibbly wobbly thing. Interesting. As we flip over to the back cover, it tells us Karsus, the largest repository of knowledge in the universe. In any universe. For there is an infinite number of potential universes. Or rather, there should be. So, why are there now just 117,863? And why, every so often, does another one just wink out of existence? The Doctor and Mel arrive in Karsus to see the Doctor's old friend Professor Rummus, but he has been murdered. Can they solve the mystery of a contracting multiverse and expose the murderer? With the ties that bind the Lamprey family to the past, present and future coming unravelled around him, only the Doctor can stop the descent into temporal chaos. But he is lost on Janus 8 and Skylus and a 20th century Earth where Rome never fell. And there we go. So that's us all set up quite nicely. And why don't we pause now and hear our first excerpt from the book, and this is courtesy of Craig Brawley.
Mel watched as the Doctor's hands darted expertly over the TARDIS console, flicking and pressing, twisting and turning every control possible. "Nearly there," he said at one point, but enough minutes had passed since then to suggest to Mel that a certain chronological exaggeration was at play here. Mel had since had a chance to change into clothing suited to what the Doctor had assured her was Karsus's hot and humid atmosphere. A slimming pair of white trousers with matching ankle boots and a puff-sleeved striped blouse, which the Doctor had remarked, when they bought it on Kolpasha a few weeks ago, made Mel resemble a well-wrapped boiled sweet. Not rising to the bait, Mel had happily purchased it, although she did ensure that it went onto the Doctor's account and not hers. She waited for the day when the Doctor actually checked his finances and discovered her little revenge. Of course, it'd be so far off that she would have little problem convincing him that he had, in fact, purchased it for her as a gift, or an apology, or whatever she would come up with when it was necessary. "Now, Mel, I'm just going to nip to the library as there's a book I want old Rummus to borrow. A collection of Heron poetry, which I just know he'll love." Mel frowned. It was unusual for the doctor to leave the control room mid-flight. "Have you programmed Carsus in, then?" "Of course," he tutted. "A flick switch here, a push button there, and the old girl knows exactly what to do." With a quick wink, he opened the door to the TARDIS corridor and vanished, with a fading "back in a mo," leaving Mel shaking her head. And as Mel looked back towards the scanner, she saw something weird. There, set into one of the roundels on the wall, was a picture. Clearly a photograph, black and white, and in a circular frame. Not only had it not been there before, it was of her and some other girl she didn't recognise. There was something about the way Mel looked in the picture, slightly off-kilter. And where had it come from? As Mel moved to get a closer look, it seemed to shimmer and fade away, leaving the more familiar, slightly backlit roundel in its position. "Well, that's not right," the doctor said, as he pored over the console. "Have you touched anything, Mel?" Mel stared open-mouthed at the doctor as he looked from the console to the scanner. "Not right at all." When had he come back in? Mel was about to answer when the doctor tapped her on the shoulder from behind. "Daydreaming, Melanie? That's not like you." And he crossed to the inner door. "Well, there isn't much time." "Oh." The doctor at the console looked over at the doctor talking and sighed. "Not again." And the TARDIS exterior doors suddenly opened, followed a second later by the doctor, taking deep breaths as if he'd been running. "Ah, yes," he gasped. "Of course, that would make sense." "Not to me it doesn't," said Mel. "Lucky you," said another voice, female. It was a woman with cropped hair, apart from a length of pigtail that ran down to below her shoulders. She was dressed in a long, washed-out red dress that appeared to have been crudely torn away just below the bum, creating the illusion of a miniskirt in an outfit that was clearly more of a maxi, and was breathlessly following this latest doctor in. "Some of us will have to get used to it," she said. Mel found herself staring at the newcomers in shock. The woman was, bizarrely, herself. And this doctor, well, he was not in the same multicoloured coat as the others, more a sombre black outfit, high-collared, quite austere, topped off with a voluminous cloak. He also had a jagged but healed gash down the left-hand side of his face, causing his left eye to be virtually sealed shut by the scar tissue. He stared at Mel through his good eye, as if not quite sure what to make of her. "Infinite combinations, infinite alternatives," he said quietly. The doctor who had initially appeared behind Mel shrugged. "I don't think this can be right." The doctor by the console shook his head. "I'm not so sure. You see, I've been pondering." The scarred doctor, who had just dashed in, cut across him. "Actually, I think you'll find..." But he too was cut off as the interior door opened and another doctor, this one carrying a small, hard-covered poetry book, entered, stopped, looked in alarm at his duplicates, and then fixed Mel with a beady glare. "Did you touch something?" Before she could reply, the doctor dressed in black held up his hand. "Listen carefully. This is very important. You need to know this." Mel was feeling very disturbed. A room full of mostly colourfully costumed, identical doctors was a little too much to bear. The Mel with the shorn hair and torn dress looked Mel directly in the face. "It's all to do with your friend, the lamprey." Something in her voice implied speech marks around the word friend, perhaps suggesting irony. Mel wasn't sure. She'd never met her double before, let alone heard herself speak. "Anyway," continued the ex-exterior doctor, "it's important that you realise the lamprey is controlling everything. Of course, there might be benign after effects, but just remember this. The incidents are..." And he and the duplicate Mel vanished, soundlessly. The doctor by the scanner sighed, and then sarcastically said, "Well, that was informative, but not entirely..." then stopped. After a beat, he continued, Oh, I see. So after we left Carsus, we went to Earth. We met up at the restaurant and... Oh yes, of course. All of which means... and vanished. Of course! Exclaimed the former shoulder tapper. I see what I meant now. Oh, Mel, the lamprey is going to... And he too was gone. The doctor with the book, Mel rather assumed this was her doctor, gently eased the interior door closed behind him. Well, I didn't understand a word of that. Did you, Mel? Mel looked at the now closed exterior doors. How come they hadn't been sucked into the space-time vortex? Oh, unless that doctor and Mel were using TARDIS doors from the future. She assumed it was the future because she had no idea what a lamprey was, despite her other self seemingly being very aware of this. Doctor, can I ask something? Of course, he replied, still staring at the various places in the control room his duplicates had stood. Unless you want an explanation. Well, that'd be nice. Can't do that. Oh, don't tell me. Time Lord secrets. Mustn't reveal the future to us poor mortals. Ancient Gallifreyan honour, yes? The doctor shook his head. No, I can't give you an explanation because I haven't the foggiest idea what any of that was about. He smiled. Still, shall we get to Carsus?
Thank you so much for that, Craig. We're now going to speak to the author, Gary Russell, about it, and if you're interested in finding out more, you can read the preview in Doctor Who magazine issue 360, which was written by David Darlington. Very interesting stuff. You can tell from reading Spiral Scratch that I've been watching a lot of CSI Miami, is the pull quote. There we go. So, less from me. Let's have more from Gary.
My name is Gary Russell, and I wrote a Sixth Doctor and Mel adventure called Spiral Scratch.
Indeed you did. So I would imagine, Gary, that having worked with Colin and Bonnie at Big Finish, that would have been a big part of your inspiration for writing this book.
You'd think, no, but it wasn't particularly. That was much more inspired, I think, when I did Instruments of Darkness. That more came out of a Big Finishy kind of thing because it had Evelyn in it. No, this was just, I'd so enjoyed writing Instruments of Darkness, and I really enjoyed writing Business Unusual. I just liked writing for the Sixth Doctor and Mel. So what I thought I'd try and do is write for lots of Sixth Doctors and lots of Mels and see if I could get it out of my system. I didn't get it out of my system. I would still write for the Sixth Doctor and Mel tomorrow, given half a chance. But yeah, it was an interesting book to go into. It was written at a very dodgy point of my life. I had a breakup right in the middle of writing it. And so I think that affects the book because the book starts quite positively and at the end of it, it's really quite a negative book. I think my mood pervades that book quite dramatically. But it started off, I can't remember which of us it was. I was sitting with my ex, she wasn't my ex at the time. And we were talking about the whole sort of multiverse thing, long before Marvel made movies about it, but I was a big fan of the old Marvel What If comics and things like that. And I think we were talking about how I had suggested the original concept for the Doctor Who Unbounds at Big Finish, which was originally Doctor Who What If, and I was doing things like, what if Turlough had accepted enlightenment instead of giving it back to the Guardians and things like that, rather than being just about alternative Doctors. And we were having a conversation about parallel universes, alternate realities and all that shit. And I said, I think what it was John had said something like, someone's just walked over my grave or something like that. That's the start of the conversation. And I said, or maybe it's your parallel alternative self having picked up that cup of tea with your left hand, not your right hand. And this turned into a big conversation. And I was saying, just imagine, you think every decision we make creates a parallel reality. So yes, you use your left hand. Yes, you move right hand. Yeah, you sit on that side of it. Yeah, you move that cushion. Yes, you pick up that book. Every time you don't do one of those creates another parallel reality. I said, but what if all the parallel reality yous that were picking up and moving and making those decisions were in the room at the same time. And that's what someone walking over your grave is literally you are in a situation where there's 10,000, 10 billion versions of you, all 1 nanosecond, one tom-tit apart from each other. And that sort of became the inspiration for doing Spiral Scratch. Was I just suddenly thought, that's a really interesting thing if you're a Time Lord as well, because you can sense, the Doctor can always sense that kind of thing. And like Invasion of the Dinosaurs, he's the only one that can push through all that time fluctuation and turn the switch off the Golden Age machine and all that sort of stuff. So I was like, yeah, this would be a really interesting thing to do in a Doctor Who story. And I knew it wouldn't work on audio. I have to say, having reread the book, I actually think it probably could, because it would be an interesting way to fox the listener, because you'd never know which Doctor and Mel you were talking to, or hearing from rather. But I thought at the time this wouldn't work on audio, and so I pitched it to Justin. He hadn't. I think this was the first time that I pitched to Justin rather than him coming to me and saying, "Do you want to write a Doctor Who book?" And I pitched this idea, and this was, of course, coming to the very end. I think at the point it was pitched, and probably at the point, not the point it was written, we knew at the point it was written, but I think when it was probably pitched to him, we didn't really know that the new series was coming back. And as a result, Spiral Scratch is one of the very last Past Doctor adventures that BBC Books did in their paperback ranges. There's only 2 or 3 afterwards. That shows how long it took for me to write it. But it was quite a fun sort of sign-off from me to that series of books, because I'd enjoyed doing Business Unusual, I'd enjoyed doing Divided Loyalties, I'd enjoyed doing Instruments of Darkness. I didn't enjoy the writing process, I think, of Spiral Scratch, because, as I said, my head was in 10,000 different places by the time I was halfway through the book. But actually the end result is not as bad as I remembered. Reading it again, it got terrible reviews at the time. Oh my God, it really was a case of this person should never be allowed to ever write a Doctor Who book again. It was just virulent. And I think the reason for that is this was also my book, my way of saying to everyone, look, there were so many people criticising Big Finish, which obviously I was in charge of at the time and very proud of, for saying, you're doing things that mean that the books and the audios and the TV show can't all coexist in the same universe. And I was thinking, well, actually, I'm not. I'm just making, hopefully, good stories for audio. But it kind of affected my mood when I went into Spiral Scratch. I thought, no, if I'm doing all these alternate realities, I'm kind of saying that actually all these things can coexist. They're all just a millisecond apart. And not one single reviewer picked up on this. Justin did, and tried to convince me to change it. And I said, I don't want to. I want to leave it open to interpretation. But really and truly, the Doctor and Mel that lead this story are not necessarily the Doctor and Mel from the TV show or the Doctor and Mel for the audios, because neither of them recognise Evelyn. When Mel sees Evelyn at the end, she didn't recognise her. And it's like in my previous book, they've had an adventure together. And it was just me kind of going, look, there are all these different myriad things, and we followed this particular Sixth Doctor and Mel. Maybe that's not the Sixth Doctor and Mel at all. Maybe that's the ultimate twist of this book, is that actually what happens to them. Because someone said, oh, who gave you the right to give Colin Baker the send-off, and have him regenerate and all that sort of stuff? And my argument was, well, it's just that's how this Doctor regenerates. And I remember saying many, many years later, somebody at Big Finish said to me, look, we're going to do a final Colin Baker story, and it's going to conflict with your book. And I was like, it really isn't, because there's room for 10,000 different endings for Colin Baker for the Sixth Doctor. And that's that was a little sort of rug I enjoyed pulling at the end of Spiral Scratch. And nobody, other than Justin, as far as I'm aware of, ever picked up on it. No, none of the reviewers, nobody who has ever spoken to me about it has ever gone, oh, it's clever, it's not even the real Sixth Doctor. And I'm not saying it isn't the Sixth Doctor, Mel. I'm just saying it's a way out. It's a possibility. The whole book is about our perceptions of what's real and what isn't, and who is who is Dr. Prime, who is Mel Prime, what is Earth Prime. I just thought, yeah, it's just fun to sort of go, which is which, who knows at the end.
Yeah.
And a lot of fun having lots of different Mels and lots of different Sixth Doctors.
Justin Richards is, of course, a very wise man to spot this.
He was, well, yes, he was very wise, but I'm glad I won. He did say, I don't think you should do this. I think you should not suggest that they've just read an entire book that may or may not be about the Sixth Doctor and Mel. And I was like, I think, I was almost disappointed that he'd spotted it, but of course of course he was going to spot it. But I was also secretly glad when not one single reviewer or one single person who ever came up and shouted at me for writing this terrible book had ever seemed to have caught on to this. The whole point of the book is none of it is necessarily real. You can, if you don't like it, they're just a Doctor and Mel from an alternate parallel universe that split off 10 seconds before the book started or something like that, or maybe it happens halfway through the book. Who knows when all these divergent versions come up.
Yeah.
So I had a ball writing it in that respect. It was the first book I think where Justin had made me sit down, because it was quite tortuous. He'd made me sit down and write, if not a detailed synopsis, I had to do little diagrams showing which Doctor and Mel we're with now and how this all works together. And I remember having one of the first things I wrote of it. This is a book that I wrote in different ways and glued it together. I kind of wrote all the Sixth Doctor and Melanie Ball stuff. Then I wrote the Sixth Doctor and Roman Mel stuff and all of this. And I wrote all their bits and then kind of went back and glued it all together. And I remember writing the bit at the beginning where Helen disappears and that Lord Lamprey is the only other person unaffected, and then writing the parallel version of that at the end with the other Mel and Doctor, all from everyone else's points of view. And I loved doing all that. And Justin and I sat down and sort of like with this jigsaw puzzle, we're putting it all together. And he was going, no, hang on a minute. We haven't had a resolution to that bit. All right, tack. And I'd write another couple of paragraphs and say, what if we did this instead? And he'd go, oh, yeah, that would be brilliant. And we worked really, really tightly on it, because he could see that, knowing me, that if we didn't, I was going to end up writing stuff that didn't work. And there's one error in the book, which is really annoying to me and has annoyed me ever since it came out, in which one of the things we did was we changed the name of the planet where the library is. And in the original book, it's called Ariel. And in the final book, it's called Cassus, I think.
Yes.
And there's a reference to Ariel in the book. They talk about going back to Ariel just in one line. And it's like, and why did neither of us pick up on that? I would have sworn that we must have done a straightforward search and replace.
Yeah.
One point, but maybe I had misspelled Ariel and some copy setter went, oh no, that's not how you spell Ariel, and put it right, and in doing so we all missed that there's this one reference to Ariel still in there. But yeah, it's been a pleasure rereading that one, actually, and seeing that when I try I can be quite clever and over clever, if you like. But yeah, everyone hated it. It got terrible reviews. DWM slated it. I think Dreamwatch slated it. Starburst or TV Zone slated it. Obviously, everyone on the internet hated it because it was me. So yeah, it was like, so for many, many years, I've always said to people, they say, oh, what's your best book? I go, oh, I don't really have a best book. What's your worst book? Oh, Spiral Scratch. Because I think I was led to believe that by a lot of people. And from a writing point of view, my head was not on the game writing it. But rereading it again now, 20 years later, it's actually really good and exciting. And I'd forgotten any of the story. I was reading it going, this is brill. This is, what's going on here? It was a bit like the other day when I was saying to you about Glamour Chase, reading it and thinking, I don't remember how this book ends, which is quite fun when you're reading a book you've written.
Yeah. Well, you know how this one was going to end, but maybe not quite the mechanics of how they got there.
But no, I knew that when I was writing it, but when I was rereading it now, I didn't. I'd actually forgotten that I did the regeneration at the end. I genuinely had forgotten that. As I was reading it along, I thought, oh, hang on a minute, this is the one that I have been regenerating at the end, isn't it? Oh, yeah. Oh, how did I get leave the girl, it's the man I want in there? Because I remember saying to Justin that had to be the last line of the book, so that it went bang into the title sequence of McCoy. But that was always the intention. Again, that was on our little flow chart. We didn't talk about what that scene was or anything. We just always referred to it as "leave the girl, it's the man I want."
Yeah, a moral for some to live their lives by, but there we go. But I particularly enjoyed all the different Mels and their relationships. We've got the sci-fi Mel with her shaven head and the ponytail, and then we've got obviously Melanie Ball, the half Silurian version.
Yes, whose dad was a character in Scales of Injustice. But obviously this is a nice version of him. Well, actually, he turns out not to be that bad anyway, but yeah. But yes, that was a kiss back. I think that, thinking about it now, was Justin's idea to use a name from Scales of Injustice. I don't think I did originally. And he said, or he might have said, why don't we use an established Silurian name so people will always know immediately that it's a Silurian? And I thought, well, I can't really call her Melody Mockdell or whatever, Morker or Melanie Ockdell or Menikatu. It's just like, no. So I think we settled on one of the names from Scales of Injustice, which he was more than happy with.
Absolutely, keeping the continuity all together.
I enjoyed that, and I felt very, very sad because I killed everyone. I think Roman Mel, who's an absolute bitch, she gets a nice sort of, her death moment is quite earned. Whereas Melanie Ball's death is like, when I was reading it, I said, I forgot I killed her off. I was thinking she and her doctor went off quite happily together. But no, nobody does. Gary kills everyone again. But yeah, I enjoyed writing this. And I suppose going back to what you originally asked me is, did working at Big Finish, it influenced, I suppose, those three different iterations of Mel, because I could hear Bonnie in all of them. And you can't necessarily hear Mel in them, but you can definitely hear Bonnie in all of them. And at one point, this has only just come back to me, at one point I was going to have the Mel and the Valeyard from Majestic Scars. And Justin and I talked about that, and he said the drawback is you've then got to suddenly explain who the Valeyard is in a book that is all about 6 Doctors and Mel. And I went, yeah, that's a good point. But that version of Mel that I'd written for the Jests, and that working with Bonnie on that, giving her a chance to play something dirty and gritty, it definitely influenced the Roman Mel. It was like, yeah, that's if I couldn't have the one from He Jests Scars, Roman Mel is the closest to that version of Mel. And there's another storyline that got completely aborted. There was another 6th Doctor and Mel storyline that went on, and I think that only went in for a couple of drafts, and they weren't very interesting. And I think Justin said, you know what, we've got 3. I think that's enough. You're going to have the big conflab at the end where everything comes together. He said, I don't think you need a 4th parallel storyline. So I sort of amalgamated a lot of this other one, which there wasn't anything particularly interesting about. It was a doctor. So Melanie Ball's with the doctor who's wearing the black cloak that Colin always wanted. That's Roman Doctor who's in the black cloak, isn't it? So Melanie Ball's with the blue coat, I think. No. So maybe I did a blue Doctor, a real-time Doctor or something like that, but it wasn't with Evelyn, it was with a version of Mel. And this was a version of Mel who had, after, in a universe where Business Unusual went wrong, she was semi-auton, like Kieran and Kellen had been. And then Justin went, I think we've got enough, we don't need a 4th set. So a lot of those ideas got sort of pushed into the other 2 Mels, into Melanie Ball or Roman Mel. And that was a very wise decision by him. And that only went through, I think, probably, I don't think I even got to the end of the book with that still in there. I think that came out quite early on, because I kept showing Justin my workings, my flowcharts, and he was going, oh, no. Don't have yet another one.
Interesting. I would say I did picture the Roman Doctor with the black cloak as being quite Baban as well, given that he's got his scar and his eye closed as well.
Yeah. What I wanted was to present visually someone you'd think was a bastard, and actually he's the nicest Doctor of all of them, although he doesn't like the Romans very much. Oh, and the other thing, of course, I do in Spiral Scratch, because it's a book by me, so it has to happen. I have kids who are quite heroic, most of whom die. in fairly unpleasant ways. You set up these four kids that are going to be the lampreys chronal thing, and then two of them are in love with each other, so they've got to die because nobody can be happy. Not in Gary Russell's world, certainly not at that point when I was writing that. I said, right, as far as I'm concerned, everyone in the world is an evil bastard and they can all die horribly. And that certainly, I don't think it'd be my intention when I started the book, but by the time I finished it, I was in a very different mental state. Suddenly the kids had to die. So they did.
Something you wouldn't have let through for compliances a few years later, but hey.
No, of course not. If anyone else had done it, I'd say absolutely not.
How dare they? That's your job.
My books do feature children who don't come out very well. There's a lot of children that die in Business Unusual. There's children that die in Scales of Injustice. Don't remember children dying particularly in Placebo Effect or Divided Loyalties. And then, the hero kids die in this one.
Stop twirling your moustache, you swine. The lampreys.
People say to me, why have you never been a dad? And I think, well, because obviously I just kill children.
So the lampreys.
Yeah.
What a fantastic creation, particularly using that imagery as well.
So I have always loved lampreys. I think they're brilliant monsters. I don't think it was Justin. I think it must have been in a review. Somebody pointed out, these are the things from Mark Platt's book. And I was like, shit, that had never crossed my mind.
Yep, the process.
Yeah, that's what it was called. That had never crossed my mind. And yet there's that cover with a massive great lamprey on the front of it, and it lives in the sort of weird time vortex thing. That had never been something that crossed my mind when I wrote Spiral Scratch at all. And I was quite cross with myself. I just love lampreys. I think they're a fantastic organism, and I think it's a lovely word. So yeah, and there are other things. My brain's suddenly going there. I'd written about lampreys before in other stuff, not in Doctor Who stuff, and so it was something that had been in my head as a great Doctor Who monster. The other thing that I wrote about in this book, which I return to in other work later on, is the old legend of the Green Children, found in the 17th, 16th, 17th century.
Using the cave for access.
Yes. And I really wanted to write a book about that. And I've written other stuff in other mediums about the same legend of the Green Children. It's a fascinating legend where these two green children came from and where they disappeared to and who they took with them. So that was there, and that was a bit of a launch ground for the story. And the other thing, so this story has a set of characters from Romania fleeing post-war East Europe. And that, the section on the boat in particular, was a book I wrote as a trial. Somebody had commissioned me to novelize something, which I'm not going to say what it was because I can't, because it didn't happen. But I was commissioned to novelize this. It was a stage play and turn it into a book. And so all of that stuff, those characters and the stuff on the boat, although I renamed everyone, obviously, all started life as this novelization a couple of years earlier. And I'd so enjoyed writing about the stuff at the university and this and the persecution and the family fleeing to, I think originally it was to New York, not the UK. And so I just, all that stuff sitting on my Mac. And, writers always say, never delete anything. You'll always find a way to reuse it. So I literally lifted the boat section, rewrote the character names, tweaked the story, and went back and did the same with the stuff in the university. And so I saved myself quite a lot of time and a few thousand words by reusing something that I'd already written sometime earlier for a project that never actually happened. And that was quite a fun way to kickstart the story, because that gave me an intro into everything with the lampreys and the family and everything, and the people who would be working for them not realizing, and the East European guy having the affair with Monica Lamprey, although she wasn't called Monica Lamprey then, and all of that sort of stuff. And that all just came out of a completely unconnected, nothing to do with sci-fi whatsoever novelization. And I thought, yeah, I can turn this into a Doctor Who book. So yeah, that's sort of all my origin moments for Spiral Scratch.
Yeah, fantastic. And of course, we do get to the ending and we get cameos from, I mentioned earlier, Evelyn Frobisher pops up in there. Perry gets a mention in passing earlier in the book as well.
Yes, she died.
Brown Perpigillium, yes.
Yes. I wanted to do the regeneration. I mean, that was like someone was going to have to do it at some point, and I wanted it to be me. And Justin took absolutely no persuasion to let me do it, which is good. He just wanted to keep a careful eye on it. And so, yes, I just thought the idea that all these doctors in these alternate parallel realities, whatever, are being destroyed by the lamprey one by one, which is quite a terrible thing when you think about those realities, because they've just lost their doctor. And so I thought there has to be a big payoff for that. And the big payoff is for the doctor to be able to stop that and destroy the lampreys for good and save billions of other alternative reality versions of himself. There had to be a punishment. And the punishment was he's dying. He is killed. And Mel gets him into the TARDIS like Joe Grant did in Planet of the Daleks. There's even the same IKEA furniture mentioned. And he regenerates. And then the Rani walks in. Having the TARDIS being buffeted, and they don't know why the TARDIS is being buffeted, but the TARDIS is obviously being buffeted by the Rani's big laser gun from LaCursha that somehow she shoots into outer space and hits the TARDIS. Don't ask me why. And led into that. And I just wanted to be the person that wrote Colin's last story and give him a dignified ending. It had been hinted at in other books. I think it started with Paul, but I think Craig had done it and a couple of other people had done it, that there was this suggestion that the Sixth Doctor threw away his life to bring about the Seventh Doctor because that would save the universe or something in a lot of the Virgin New Adventures. And I just thought that was a slap in the face to Colin. I wanted him to have a more heroic departure, and therefore Sparrow Scratch says that that's how it is in this book. But, you know, Time is Champion and all these other versions of the Six Doctors, along with real-time Doctors with cybernetic Evelyns and things, they all still exist. They're all still out there, and they all can parallel and weave in and out because the differences between them are microscopic in some cases.
So, of course, Spiral Scratch wasn't always this book's title, was it?
No, this was the one that was called A Different Kind of Tension originally. And Justin didn't like it. So I went for a different Buzzcocks song, which kind of then I had to write spirals into it. Yeah, it was called A Different Kind of Tension. Is that what you were thinking it was called?
No, I was thinking of Future Nostalgia.
Future Nostalgia? Was that?
That's even in DWM.
Do you know, if you'd said to me, which of my books was originally called Future Nostalgia, I'd have said it was Invasion of the Cat People. No, you're absolutely right. It is. It's Future Nostalgia. Yeah. See, they're all related to Buzzcocks. Yeah. It was called Future Nostalgia. But it was originally called different. It was submitted to Justin under Different Kind of Tension, which he didn't like. He says far too long for a Doctor Who book title, which I thought fair enough. So yes, then I wrote it, I suppose, as Future Nostalgia, and then I must have come up with Spiral Scratch at some point, probably because I put the spirals in, or I think I probably put the spirals in because I called it Spiral Scratch. Yeah, Future Nostalgia is a great name for a book, isn't it?
Love it.
Should have stuck to that, really. Though, actually, Future Nostalgia, as it turns out, has absolutely bugger all to do with the story. Whereas at least Spiral Scratch does. Yeah, I can see why it would have changed from Future Nostalgia. I think as it went on more and more with the duplicate Doctors and everything, Future Nostalgia kind of would have made no sense.
And what did you think of the cover?
Well, it hasn't got a spiral on it, which is what made me cross. So I doodled, as I usually do with these covers with Black Sheep, what I wanted. They used the right picture of Colin Baker. It's the picture of Colin Baker from Twin Dilemma, where he's standing outside the TARDIS on the planet where they find Kevin McNally. And I said, and I want a spiral behind it. Just black and white spiral. And I don't get a spiral. I get some sort of weird, zigzaggy, jagged thing that isn't... It's like, did no one at Black Sheep understand what a spiral is? But I remember saying to... I think it was Steve Cole at that point. No, it probably was Justin doing the... I'm I'm sure Steve was in charge of the cover side of it. Justin was the editor, but Steve was probably at the BBC doing stuff. He must have been. And I remember saying to him, but it's not a spiral. And him sort of saying, look, it's Black Sheep. We're lucky they even got the right doctor on the front cover. Which I think was probably, a fairly good response, really. But it's not a spiral. It's a silly set of jagged lines, which is as far from a spiral as you can get.
Well, I'm so pleased that you enjoyed coming back to it, and it's made you smile.
I did. I really did. I was listening to you. I was dreading it. I'd said to you in the past, let's leave Spiral Scratch at the end because it's the worst one. And I shall never again say to anyone, what's your worst book? And I won't say Spiral Scratch. I don't know what I will say. I've got to find one that's really shit now, to me. I mean, obviously the rest of the world will carry on saying Spiral Scratch is the worst book you've ever written and you should die for it. But, I won't say that anymore.
Thanks again, Gary.
No problem, Kenny. Thank you.
Brilliant stuff, as always, from Gary. Now, before we move on to have a look at the contemporary review at the time of publication, and indeed what people think about it now, we're going to pause and have a second reading from the book. And ever since we started doing these book club episodes on a regular basis, something I've always enjoyed are the readings that we get from our brilliant team who give up their time and do these readings for us. And today's one, I think, is a little special because Craig has read the whole of the final chapter of this book, and we're going to bring it to life now with some sound effects, a bit of music, and sit back, relax, and enjoy. Unless you're walking, of course. Over to you, Craig.
The TARDIS control room had never seemed so bright, so warm, so inviting. Mel was all but dragging the Doctor inside as she looked around her. As if by magic, part of the far wall opened up and a long bed emerged. Perhaps the TARDIS could tell its pilot was desperately ill, Mel decided. The Doctor waved a hand almost irritably towards the bed, and it was absorbed by the wall once more. "I'm fine, Mel." He glanced up to the ceiling as Mel closed the doors behind them. "No, really I am." He then smiled at Mel. "We didn't do too badly, did we?" "We?" laughed Mel. "We did nothing. You, on the other hand, just saved the multiverse. Literally for once." "For once?" "Mel, we save the multiverse once a week, don't we?" "Not usually, no. You're usually satisfied with a race, or a planet, a galaxy at the most." She could tell he was masking his pain behind his bonhomie, of course. "But seriously, Doctor, I think you need to rest. The lamprey really took it out of you. Again, literally." The Doctor took a deep breath and stood proudly by his precious TARDIS console. "Nonsense, Mel. What harm could possibly befall one such as I?" At which point he began coughing and spluttering. Mel ran to his side instantly, trying to pat him on the back. Being considerably shorter than he, this merely resulted in a few ineffectual thumps to a couple of middle vertebrae. He gently eased her hand back. I think some rest might be in order after all." "Doctor's orders," suggested Mel cheekily. He nodded and smiled back at her. And Mel's heart went cold. She'd been travelling with him long enough to be able to read the Doctor well by now. This avuncular man who she trusted with her life. A man whose moods and quirks she could pretty much predict these days. A Time Lord. So much power contained in such a frail body, despite its appearance of, pretty solidness anyway. But who really knew what made Time Lords tick? Even these days, Mel was aware that she couldn't entirely be sure of how well the Doctor might be. Having witnessed that final struggle as the lamprey was extinguished, she was forced to question whether the Doctor should have accepted that constant absorption of energy and light. Could his form really have just taken that punishment and then shrugged it off as easily as he made out? "Doctor, listen to me. Rummus warned you what it might take to stop it." The Doctor was leaning on the TARDIS console, gripping it tightly enough that his knuckles were white with the strain. "So what? Okay, I might not be able to regenerate 12 times, 11, 10 maybe. Who cares?" "You should." "Why? Look at the scanner, Mel, look at that. All those stars and worlds and races and civilizations. They could have all gone the way of poor Professor Tungard if I had not stopped it. As sacrifices go, I could afford it, and I truly believe it was worth it. Mel was at his side. She placed a hand on his and drew it away quickly. Doctor, you're ice cold. I mean, absolutely frozen. Really? Can't feel it myself. His gaze was still on the scanner. Mel, could you press that blue switch, please? Why? Because I asked nicely. Mel did as she was told, and instantly the TARDIS roared into life, the central column rising and falling as they left Carsus for what she hoped would be the last time. A few seconds later, it stopped and the scanner just showed space again. Mel frowned, but the Doctor smiled, albeit weakly. Hover mode. I just want to look one last time at the local cosmos. What do you mean one last time? The Doctor finally pried his hands away from the console, trying to work the fingers, but to no avail. He stared straight at Mel, and she suddenly realised she was facing not a man in his mid-40s, as he normally appeared, but a tired, drained man, who just this once she could believe was 900 plus years. His blue eyes were grey, the crow's feet more pronounced, and his hair had a few grey roots and curls, especially at the temples. We did good, Mel. I'm honoured to have had you at my side one last time. And he fell to the floor with a loud crump. Mel was at his side in a second, resting his head on her lap, massaging his temples. Come on, Doctor, no time to be sleeping. She looked up at the scanner. All those stars still twinkling. All the planets still revolving. All the life that owed its continued existence to a man, a wonderful, brave man it had never known. Might never know. She realised she was crying, and a tear dropped onto the Doctor's face. His skin was very grey now. His eyes flickered open, and he smiled tightly. Don't cry, Mel. It was my time. Or maybe not, but it was my time to give, to donate. I've had a good innings, you know, seen and done a lot. Can't complain this time. Don't feel cheated. Mel couldn't understand what he was saying. He couldn't be dying. Had letting his chronon energy be absorbed to that degree really destroyed him? Finally? No, she whispered. It's not fair. Yes it is, she heard him say, but the words seemed to be in her head, rather than coming from his closed mouth. She suddenly found herself remembering their initial meeting in Brighton, an initial enmity that had given way to respect, admiration, and finally a great enough affection that she had given it all up to join him aboard the TARDIS, to travel the universe. The TARDIS lights seemed to have dimmed a fraction, as if she knew, understood. Mel wished she did. Then the TARDIS lurched violently, once, twice, 3 times. The Doctor was rocked out of her hands, and he curled up, facing the bottom of the console. Local tractor beam, he said aloud this time, trying to raise his hand, trying to reach up, grab the console, and haul himself upright. Mel watched for a second, convinced that he'd succeed. Of course he would. If they were under some sort of attack, the Doctor would leap into action and save the day again. He had to. Doctor, she whispered as, instead, his arm drooped and he was still once more. His skin was the colour of granite now, and Mel was sure it was blurring slightly. Had to be her own tears, distorting her vision. The force of the tractor beams, another one rocked the TARDIS again, had sent her a couple of feet away from the Doctor, and the floor seemed to be at a severe angle. She tried to crawl towards him, but another blow, then another, and Mel suddenly wondered if this was what it felt like to be a deep-sea diver going down too rapidly, getting the bends. She felt, somehow, that the TARDIS was indeed going down, being dragged through space, like a roller coaster car in freefall. And then it was all over. The TARDIS landed with an enormous, juddering thump, but in her ears, in her mind, it seemed as if the noise was still going on, and she knew then that she had failed the Doctor. He was dying in front of her eyes, and her own brain was closing down, trying to block off the effects of the crash landing, or whatever it was, by making her sleep. She would fight unconsciousness. She'd been knocked out before. She knew that she could catch it, stop it. She knew she could. She knew. No, it wasn't fair. Wait. The TARDIS door was opening. How? No one had operated the door controls. They must have been forced. Mel could barely keep her eyes open. The darkness that wanted to consume her was winning, and she was losing the battle. Let it go, she heard her inner voice say. Sleep. With a final effort, Mel rolled onto her back, facing the doorway. As unconsciousness took a hold, she was sure there were people there. They moved towards her, and as she finally succumbed to complete sensory deprivation, she heard a strident female voice barking out an order.
Leave the girl. It's the man I want.
There we go. I just had to give the Colin theme right at the end. It just made more sense, didn't it? A bit of closure for the Sixth Doctor, with a little bit of Seventh creeping in there with Keith McCullough's music. Thanks again to Craig for that. So, let's turn to the pages of Doctor Who magazine. We're looking at issue 363, and this review was written by Matt Michael, friend of the podcast. You can hear him with me on Pieces of Eighth as well. What's worse than a temporal anomaly that threatens to destroy the universe? The answer, at least according to Spiral Scratch, is a rift in the space-time vortex that places multiple parallel realities in danger. In medieval England, 2 green children are pulled from a pit. In 1950s Britain, Sir Bernard Lamprey throws a birthday party for his daughter, Helen. In Romania, a professor and his family flee persecution. Halfway across the universe, the Sixth Doctor and Mel visit the Doctor's old friend Rummus in the library of Karsus, only to discover his corpse. All these events are connected, and it will take all of the Doctor's ingenuity to find a solution to universal apocalypse. Gary Russell's association with the Sixth Doctor goes back a long way. In one of the first BBC novels, Business Unusual, Russell told the tale of Mel's initial arrival in the TARDIS, an event we never saw on television, while a later book, Instruments of Darkness, paired audio companion Evelyn Smythe with Mel for the first time. In a way, it's surprising that Russell chose to tell this particular story in print, rather than as a Big Finish audio, as the reader gets the sense that he relishes Colin Baker's fruity performance, and has immense affection for Mel. Certainly, Spiral Scratch gave us more Sixth Doctor per pound than any other. The multiple universes allowing Russell to not only use the more mellow and personable Doctor from the audio plays, but also to introduce an expansive and scar-faced version from a dimension where Rome never fell, as well as tying up to various unbound Sixth Doctors from plays, such as Real Time. The book suffers from some clunky prose and dialogue, flaws it shares with the Sixth Doctor's TV stories. Russell is more comfortable writing soapy characters than pseudoscience. The technobabble he employs to explain the eponymous Scratch is headache-inducingly convoluted. Despite this, there are moments of real pathos, particularly when 2 parents visit the grave of their child. Throughout the book, Russell develops a genuine momentum that keeps the reader, if not hooked, then at least interested right up to the climax, whose similarity to the denouement of The Parting of the Ways is purely coincidental. As the last Sixth Doctor novel for the time being, Spiral Scratch fairly accurately reflects all that is good and bad about Colin Baker's tenure, with a big bold plot that has too many ideas vying for space. The alternate realities, the Da Vinci Code style art mysteries, the universe-eating monsters, for anyone to develop into anything much. Still, the author can be accused of a lack of imagination. There is more to Spiral Scratch than any of the recent past Doctor books, and it is a great deal more fun and more memorable to boot. A black mark for Black Sheep, though, for producing a cover that looks like it was done by a madman, finger painting with his own vomit. So Matt's not a fan of the cover then, I think it's fair to say. So that's the DWM opinion. Let's have a look at Goodreads and see what you, the readers, think. Well, Spiral Scratch has a rating of 3.48. It's had 143 ratings and 20 reviews. So from these, 5 stars, 22%, 4 stars, 27%, 3 stars, 31%, 2 stars, 13%, and 1 star, 5%. Let's start with a 5-star review. This is from Preetam Chatterjee. Preetam says, Spiral Scratch isn't just another Doctor Who novel. It's a swan song, a metaphysical time puzzle, and a love letter to Colin Baker's Sixth Doctor, wrapped in quantum chaos and multiverse madness. With this book, Gary Russell sets out to do something no televised episode ever properly did: give the Sixth Doctor a true, meaningful, and emotionally resonant farewell. And oh boy, does he deliver, with heart, style, and a whole lot of interdimensional weirdness. The story begins in classic Who fashion. Reality is breaking down, timelines are collapsing, and something very, very hungry is devouring alternate universes. But rather than running away, the Doctor, bold, brash, and more emotionally aware than we often saw him on TV, dives straight into the storm. Alongside the ever-curious Mel Bush, he begins unravelling a cosmic plot involving shadowy parasites, alternate selves, collapsing timelines, and a threat that might just require the ultimate sacrifice. Russell's narrative swings big. This is high-concept sci-fi on a cosmic scale. Fractured realities, quantum entanglements, multiple versions of characters, and a villain whose motives are both tragic and terrifying. But at its heart, Spiral Scratch is about regret, choice, and legacy. What defines a person when there are a million versions of them scattered across the multiverse? What does it mean to be this Doctor, this Mel, in this moment? One of the book's most powerful feats is how it reclaims the Sixth Doctor's arc. Often remembered for loud jackets and louder moods, this Doctor is rendered with deep internal conflict, fierce intelligence, and real emotional weight. He's still arrogant and sharp-tongued, but there's vulnerability beneath the bravado, and Spiral Scratch makes it mean something. This Doctor chooses to end, not in some off-screen tumble between regenerations, but in an act of heroism and sacrifice that feels earned. Gary Russell's prose is brisk, smart, and packed with references that long-time fans will gobble up like jelly babies. The pacing is brisk, the stakes apocalyptic, and the emotional payoff hits like a well-aimed sonic screwdriver to the chest. In essence, Doctor Who Spiral Scratch is multiverse sci-fi done with soul. It's a redemption arc, a regeneration in all but name, and a must-read for anyone who believes the Sixth Doctor deserved better. It proves that even in a swirling vortex of collapsing realities, what truly matters is the heart inside the TARDIS. 4 stars from Harry. This is one book in particular that has interested me for a long time, not just because the cover itself is fantastic, but also that it is an alternative regeneration story for the Sixth Doctor. Having experienced the ultimate foe, the Sixth Doctor, The Last Adventure, and now this, I can say that this, in my opinion, is my favourite version of a Sixth Doctor regeneration. I recently bought the re-release of Time's Champion, which I have yet to read, but so far, Spiral Scratch is my favourite version of the 4 6-y finales. The book itself is actually well paced, and there is always something interesting going on. I was told before going into this book that it's quite crazy, but just to stick with it, which I did, and I'm glad I did so. What's interesting about this book is that Gary Russell stated that when he wrote this book, he wasn't in a great place at the time, and didn't feel as though he wrote something that wasn't as good as he could have made it. Personally, I thought this was such an enjoyable read. It's probably one of my favourite Doctor Who books. I don't want to give away much, just my general opinion of the book. If you're a fan of the Sixth Doctor, then this is definitely recommended. That's if you can find it for a reasonable price. This is definitely how the Sixth Doctor should have regenerated in the show. 3 stars from Natalie. Natalie says, Spiral Scratch is probably one of the better of Russell's Doctor Who's out there, but that's not really saying much. At the very least, this entry to the Whoniverse is fast-paced and interesting. However, it's also messy and confusing. The story involves multiverses clashing, and this isn't immediately revealed to the reader, nor is the indication of which Doctor we are following. The reader is just supposed to figure it out through context. A clear delineation of chapters belonging to the alternate Doctors and Melks would have been helpful. I would be several pages into a section before I realised it was from the perspective of an alternate Doctor, and I felt like I needed to go back and restart it. It was beyond frustrating. Unfortunately, this isn't a story that you can read a small amount and put down again, because you will be hopelessly lost. This is one of those Doctor Who's where I feel like I got the basic gist of the story, but I'm sure I didn't get all of it. What's good about this then? The Doctor, in brackets 6, is marvellously in character, as well as Mel. The story is engaging for the most part, and really does make you think. It's certainly not awful, but could have been executed more clearly and concisely. As for the end, well, it ties into the 7th Doctor's first episode. This part was done well, and made me want to rewatch Time in the Rani, and I'm not a huge fan of McCoy. This 6th Doctor book is okay, if a bit scattered, and fills a gap in the Doctor Who lore. If you need to scratch that itch, this will do nicely. Thank you very much for that one. Next up, a 2-star review from Lawrence. One thing I took from Harold T. Wilkins' Flying Saucers Uncensored, and probably the only thing, was that I should probably get around to reading Spiral Scratch. Wilkins' book refers to a folk tale about a couple of mysterious children who turned up in rural Suffolk back in the 12th century. They spoke a language no one could understand and had green skin, so the legend has it, and I recalled this particular piece of Forteana from the opening pages of Spiral Scratch, a Who novel I'd started 3 or 4 times, but never actually read beyond the first chapter, and the reason I'd never got around to reading it was because it can be unfortunately difficult to get excited about anything written by Gary Russell. As Doctor Who obsessives doubtlessly recall, the television show went a bit wobbly back in the second half of the 80s, resulting in Colin Baker being unceremoniously replaced by Sylvester McCoy as lead actor, meaning Baker never had a proper on-screen swan song. Unsurprisingly, there have therefore been a number of fan-generated versions of Baker's final story, thus attempting to send off the 6th version of the character with a bit more dignity than Sylvester McCoy in a blonde wig. Craig Hinton and Chris McKeon took a shot at it with Times Champion, which, as I recall, was pretty bloody awful. And there's also this. Spiral Scratch is one of those alternate reality deals. Something called the Lamprey is consuming variant universes, and only Colin Baker and Bonnie Langford stand in its way, with chapters all named after songs by the Buzzcocks, which is at least less obnoxious than the usual roll call of Morrissey B-sides. It's not the greatest thing I've ever read, although it's probably amongst Russell's better efforts. His prose tends towards workmanlike descriptions of occurrences one can imagining happening on the telly without too great a stretch of the imagination. There's a little more reliance on sentiment than I generally enjoy, and too much nominal sentences as bloody usual, but Russell is far from the worst offender in such respects, and almost gets away with it here. If the story was a little more coherent, he probably would have got away with it, but it's just a little too easy to lose track of who is doing what and why. Oddly, the end result is vaguely reminiscent of Moorcock's occasionally free-range or otherwise impressionist narratives, which is no bad thing, and the dialogue is likewise not without a certain wit. So, it's nothing amazing, but neither is it irredeemably terrible, and the main problem is that it avoids irredeemable terribility for more pages than you really need, when the best that can be said is that it's approximately readable. I've read better, and I've read much, much worse, so I suppose that's a recommendation on some level. Isn't Lawrence fun? Finally, a 1-star review from Dylan Green. This is quite possibly one of the worst books I've ever read, not solely because the plot is a contrived mess, but the prose is completely underwhelming. It honestly started off really strong, with a lot of interesting concepts, especially for Doctor Who, where frankly, if you find something that hasn't been done before, you might as well be awarded a medal. But quickly veered off track as soon as the Doctor eventually shows up. I'm not sure if that's ironic or not. If I wasn't required to finish this book, I probably wouldn't have done, which is saying something, considering I've only ever given up on 2 books before. Well, there you go. Dylan, a man who knows his mind. Thanks for sharing that. If you're interested in sharing things, we're actually going to be sharing a lovely picture that went in Doctor Who magazine to accompany the review that we heard earlier from Matt Michael, and this is a lovely bit of art from Roger Langridge. So feel free to pop on our social media and have a look at that. You can find us on Twitter at Power of 3 Pod with a number 3, on Blue Sky at Finished Zine, and we have a Facebook group too, so pop in there and have a look and share your thoughts on this book as well. Which version of Colin's Exit do you prefer? Do you prefer Times Champion? Do you prefer the Big Finish version, or do you prefer Spiral Scratch? Let us know. So that's us, we're at the end of another episode, and it means it's time to go out with a tune. And of course, Spiral Scratch took its name from the debut EP by the Buzzcocks, released way back in 1977. And we're going to play out with Boredom, which is the most well-known song from the EP. So, let's hand it over to the boys, and we will see you soon. Until next time, I've been Kenny Smith. Bye-bye.
You know when I say what I mean, I say what comes to my mind. You see, I never get around to things. I'm living in a straight line, you know me, I'm acting dumb. You know, seeing